almost 200 years, the ocean liner has evoked images of romance and adventure on the high seas. In peacetime, liners have evoked images of travel and adventure. They have become inextricably linked with kings, presidents, and movie stars. In times of war, they have forged vital links between allies and united far-flung empires. This is a story of vision and boundless ambition, a story of technological innovation, disaster on the high seas, and standards in luxury that have never been equaled. This is a story of steam, steel, and style. This is the story of the great Atlantic liners.
The first steamship to cross the Atlantic was the American steam-powered packet ship SS Savannah. However, her steam plant only ran for a total of 85 hours on a 27-day voyage.
It was not until 1831 when the Canadian paddle steamer Royal William crossed the Atlantic from Pictou, Nova Scotia to Gravesend on the River Thames that steam was used as the primary source of power on a ship for the first time.
The Royal William was the first vessel to utilize the steam engine as her primary source of power. However, every few days the Royal William's engine had to be shut down in order to scrape the accumulated salt from the boilers.
It was not until the tandem crossings of the Sirius and the Great Western in 1838 that steam technology began to come of age. At first, the few steamships operating on the Atlantic were not much faster than the traditional packet ships they competed with. However, as the Industrial Revolution began to gather momentum, the development of steam technology began to accelerate.
A few visionaries, such as Isambard Kingdom Brunel, began to see the potential of steam-powered ships, and in 1838 Brunel began the construction of the Great Western, which was the first in a series of pioneering steamships. When she was launched, the Great Western was the fastest steamship in the world.
Around the same time, a Canadian businessman from Halifax named Samuel Cunard bid for the highly lucrative mail contract for Britain, British North America, and the United States.
He booked passage to England aboard the Great Western to be present for the launch of what was to become the first ship in a fleet of legendary and storied vessels.
Britannia was eventually joined by three nearly identical sister ships, the Acadia, the Caledonia, and the Columbia.
When she was built, the Britannia differed little from the traditional packet ships then operating on the Atlantic in the mid-19th century.
With her clipper bow and gilt ornamentation, the Britannia quickly attracted the creme de la creme of the transatlantic passenger trade.
At the same time, operating on a fixed schedule, the Cunard Line offered a degree of safety to immigrants making the crossing in search of a new life. In one fell swoop, the Cunard Line had invented the ocean liner.
June 1840, the Britannia arrived in Liverpool fresh from her builders Robert, Duncan and Co. in Greenock, Scotland.
The arrival of the Britannia was mostly ignored by the local press, and she only rated 2 lines in the local newspapers.
On Saturday, July 4, 1840, the Britannia set sail for Boston on her maiden voyage under the command of Captain Henry Woodruff, with 63 passengers on board, including Samuel Cunard and his daughter. The Britannia arrived in Boston Harbor 13 days later on July 17th. When she docked at the specially built Cunard Wharf, the passengers and crew of the Britannia were cheered enthusiastically by the crowd waiting on the dock.
One British observer called the Britannia's maiden voyage the most significant crossing of the Atlantic since the Mayflower.
In one stroke, the total transit time of an Atlantic crossing had been cut in half. The crossing of the Britannia signaled the beginning of an era that would last for more than 100 years, in addition to marking the beginning of one of the great success stories in the maritime industry.
In the meantime, the Britannia settled into what would become an illustrious career.
One of the more notable instances in the Britannia's career occurred in January 1842, when the great English novelist Charles Dickens booked passage aboard the Britannia to travel to the United States to give a series of lectures. However, he found the crossing to be rough and likened the ship to a hearse with windows. When the Britannia reached the United States, Dickens did not leave the rail until the ship was securely tied alongside the dock. Dickens booked passage on a traditional packet ship for the return crossing. In 1844, the Britannia was trapped when Boston Harbor froze, just before Britannia was set to sail home. In order to ensure that the ship set sail on time, a path was cut through the ice to the sea. In September 1847, the Britannia ran aground off Cape Race, Newfoundland.
She was pulled off and limped to New York, where she was repaired and continued on to Boston.
In 1849, she was sold to the Navy of the German Confederation, where she was named SMS Barbarossa.
In 1852, she was transferred to the Prussian Navy, where she was used as a barrack ship until 1880. In 1880, she was laid up and declared surplus. She was sunk as a target ship not long afterward. Unlike the Great Western, the construction of the Great Britain would have a far-reaching impact on steamship development. The Great Britain was to be built in a special dry dock in Bristol. In 1838, the first of two chance encounters would change the development of steamships forever. In the autumn of that year, the 213-foot iron-hulled packet ship Rainbow put into port at Bristol.
Upon learning that the Rainbow was in port, Brunel sent two of his assistants to book passage to Antwerp in order to assess the utility of using iron in shipbuilding.
Unlike the Great Western, the construction of the Great Britain would have a far-reaching impact on steamship development. The Great Britain was to be built in a special dry dock in Bristol. In 1838, the first of two chance encounters would change the development of steamships forever. In the autumn of that year, the 213-foot iron-hulled packet ship Rainbow put into port at Bristol. There were a number of advantages to building with iron as opposed to wood. At the time, wood in Britain was becoming more expensive, while iron was getting cheaper. In addition, hulls built out of iron are not subject to dry rot or being eaten by wood-boring organisms. Iron-hulled ships are also much lighter and less bulky. However, the chief advantage of building ships out of iron as opposed to wood lay in their structural strength. Up to that point, ships were limited to approximately 300 feet in length.
This was due to the phenomenon known as hogging and sagging, which caused ships' hulls to bend and flex with the motion of the waves. Due to these stresses, wooden ships were limited in size, lest they be torn apart in bad weather.
In contrast, iron-hulled ships were better able to withstand the forces being exerted on them. As a result, the use of iron made it possible to build increasingly bigger ships. With each successive draft, Brunel's plans for the Great Britain grew larger and larger, eventually growing to 322 feet long and 3,400 tons, not including passengers, cargo, and fuel.
In 1840, the second chance encounter would be equally as monumental as the first. In the spring of that year, the SS Archimedes put into port at Bristol. She had just been completed a few months before and was owned by Francis Petit Smith's Screw Propeller Steamship Company. At the time, Brunel had been looking for a way to improve the performance of the Great Britain's propulsion system and became very interested in propeller technology.
Recognizing the prestige that Brunel would bring to his own company, Smith readily agreed to loan the Archimedes to Brunel for a series of extended tests. Over the course of the next few months, Smith and Brunel tested a number of different propeller designs, and Brunel eventually settled on a four-bladed propeller design suggested by Smith.
Satisfied with the advantages offered by propeller technology over paddle wheels, Brunel sent a letter to the directors of the Great Western Steamship Company in which he argued for a second change to the half-built Great Britain, and suggested the adoption of propeller technology.
According to Brunel, the screw propeller held a number of advantages over paddle wheels. Propeller machinery was lighter and allowed more space for cargo and passengers. Screw propeller machinery was situated lower in the ship, which would improve the ship's stability in rough weather. The elimination of bulky paddle wheels would improve maneuverability in crowded harbors. The depth of paddle wheel blades is constantly changing based on changing sea conditions and the ship's draft. In comparison, a propeller is always fully submerged and therefore more efficient. Brunel's arguments were effective, and in December 1840 the company directors agreed to adapt the Great Britain to be fitted with a propeller, even though her completion date would now be delayed by 9 months.
Reporting on the Great Britain's maiden voyage in 1845 in its first issue, a reporter for Scientific American claimed, "If there is anything objectionable in the construction or machinery of this noble vessel, it is the mode of propelling her by the screw propeller, and we should not be surprised if it should be ere long superseded by paddle wheels at the sides." The floating out of the Great Britain took place on July 19, 1843. The conditions for the float out were generally good.
Eyewitnesses recorded that the day started out overcast and became sunny later on, while a report from the Bristol Mirror set the scene. Large crowds started to gather early in the day, including many people who had traveled to Bristol to see the spectacle. There was a general air of anticipation as the royal emblem was unfurled. The processional route had been cleaned, and Temple Street decorated with flags, banners, flowers, and ribbons. Boys of the city school and girls of the Red Maids were stationed in a neat orderly formation down the entire length of the exchange. The route was a mass of color, and everyone was on the streets, as it was a public holiday. The atmosphere of gaiety even allowed thoughts to drift away from the problems of political dissension in London.
Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's Prince Consort, departed Paddington Station at 10 a.m. aboard the royal train, which was personally conducted by Brunel. Upon arriving at the shipyard at noon, Prince Albert found that the Great Britain had already been floated out and was waiting for the royal inspection. Prince Albert boarded the ship, and after taking refreshments in the lounge, commenced his tour. Afterward, he returned to the main dining saloon where the local dignitaries had gathered.
Following the toasts and a banquet given in his honor, Prince Albert left for the naming ceremony.
It had been decided that the ship would be christened by Mrs. Clarissa Miles, the wife of Philip John Miles and the mother of Philip John William Miles, the Member of Parliament for Bristol and director of the company.
When the time came, she stepped forward, took hold of the bottle of champagne, and swung it towards the bow. However, the steam packet Avon had already begun to tow the Great Britain out of her dry dock, and as a result, the bottle of champagne fell unbroken into the water. A second bottle of champagne was quickly produced, and Prince Albert threw it as hard as he could at the ship. In their haste, the crew of the Avon had begun to tow the Great Britain out of her dry dock before all the lines had been cast off. Due to the miscommunication, the tow line broke, and the resulting delay meant that Prince Albert had to return to London, missing the end of the program.
Following the floating out, Brunel had planned to have the Great Britain towed up the Thames and fitted out. However, the harbour authorities responsible for widening the lock had not completed their work in a timely manner. The problem was exacerbated by the fact that the ship's dimensions had changed as a result of the decision to fit her with a propeller instead of paddle wheels. Brunel had also decided to install her engines before she was launched, which gave her a deeper than intended draft.
These unexpected technical and logistical headaches resulted in costly delays. Brunel's negotiations with the Bristol Dock Board dragged on for so long that the Board of Trade intervened and forced the harbour authorities to make the modifications to the lock, which began in 1844.
After being trapped in the harbour for over a year, the Great Britain was finally floated out in December 1844, but not before causing yet more headaches for her owners. The Great Britain passed successfully through the first set of locks, but got stuck in the second set, which led to the River Avon.
Only the quick thinking of Captain Claxton prevented the Great Britain from suffering serious structural damage.
That night, Brunel personally supervised an army of workmen who removed the lock gate platform and the coping stones at the junction of the lock, which allowed the tug Samson to tow the Great Britain into the River Avon. Upon her completion in 1845, the Great Britain was a revolutionary vessel. At 322 feet long and 3,400 tons, she was the biggest ship in the world.
At 322 feet long and 3,400 tons, she was the biggest ship in the world. Like most steamships built in the 19th century, the Great Britain was built with a full set of sails. Her rigging consisted of one square-rigged and four schooner-rigged masts, which reduced the amount of crew needed to trim and set her sails.
Great Britain's masts were also hinged in addition to being made of iron.
These, along with her rigging, which was made of iron wire, were intended to reduce wind resistance.
Another innovative design feature was the lack of a heavy bulwark on the main deck. Instead, Brunel had opted for a simple iron railing which reduced weight and allowed the water swept across the deck in bad weather to simply run over the side and back into the sea.
Concerned over the effects of hogging and sagging in such a large hull, Brunel intentionally over-engineered the Great Britain. Her keel was strengthened with 10 longitudinal girders.
Her ribs were 6 inches wide and 3 inches in diameter. Her keel plates were an inch thick and her hull plates were overlapped and double riveted.
The Great Britain was also the first liner to be built with a double bottom, in addition to 5 watertight bulkheads. Over 1,500 tons of iron was used to build the Great Britain, including her engines and boilers.
The Great Britain was powered by two 170-ton incline direct-action steam engines that were based on a design that had been patented by Brunel's father, Mark Isambard Brunel. The engines rose through 3 decks, stopping just below the main deck. Her engines had 88-inch bore pistons with a 6-foot stroke.
When designing the Great Britain's machinery, Brunel had no precedent to work from. The only other propeller-driven ship in the world was the Archimedes, which was powered by a spur and pinion system, which was extremely noisy and totally unsuitable for a liner.
The steam that powered her engines was provided by 3 square boilers located immediately forward of her engine room. Instead, Brunel settled on a chain drive that was mounted on a crankshaft. Between the 2 engines was a 26-foot diameter geared wheel that was connected by 4 inverted tooth chains to a smaller geared wheel that connected to the propeller shaft. The Great Britain's 68-foot long, 28-inch diameter propeller shaft was manufactured by the Mersey Iron Works and was the longest piece of machinery on the ship.
The entire length of the Great Britain's propeller shaft was bored out with a 10-inch diameter hole, which allowed cold seawater to be pumped in to reduce heat, as well as to reduce weight. It was coupled at each end to 2 secondary propeller shafts, a 28-foot shaft that was coupled to the engines, and a 25-foot shaft that was coupled to the propeller. Together they were over 120 feet long and weighed 38 tons. The entire system operated on a 3-to-1 gearing ratio, meaning that the engines operated at a speed of 18 RPMs and the propeller turned at 54 RPMs.
The Great Britain's interior was divided into 3 decks. The bottom deck was for cargo, while the upper decks were reserved for passengers. The passengers' decks were divided fore and aft by the boilers and the machinery spaces. Aft of the engine room, below the upper passenger deck, the aft dining room ran all the way astern. On each side of the stern, a corridor led to 22 passenger berths 2 deep, or 44 berths in total. Immediately aft of the engine room were 2 private sitting rooms for female passengers that could be accessed directly without entering the saloon. The 12 nearest passenger berths were reserved for female passengers. At the opposite end, all the way aft, the saloon opened onto the stern windows. The dining saloon was furnished with oak chairs that were bolted to the deck. The walls were painted delicately, while the ceiling, which was formed by the deck above, was supported with decorative pillars. Located below and aft was the 98-foot-long dining saloon, which could accommodate 360 people at a time. On either side of the dining saloon were 7 cabins with 4 berths each, for a total of 56 berths. Forward of the dining saloon was the steward's galley, while immediately aft were several tiers of sofas. The main dining saloon was the most lavishly decorated space on the ship. It was lined with 24 white and gold columns. For aesthetic effect, 8 arabesque pilasters with paintings of oriental birds and flowers lined the outside of the room. The archways over the doors leading into the rooms were carved and gilded and capped with a medallion. Numerous mirrors gave the illusion of space. The walls were painted yellow, with blue and gold highlights.
The forward saloons were arranged in a similar manner to the aft saloons. All the way forward and separated from the passenger spaces were the crew quarters. In contrast to the times in which she was built, the Great Britain was decorated in a somewhat subdued but refined style, perhaps due to the diminishing financial resources of her builders. In total, the Great Britain cost £117,000 to build, £47,000 more than her initial estimate of £70,000.
On July 26, 1845, 7 years after the Great Western Steamship Company set out to build her, the Great Britain set sail from Liverpool bound for New York with 45 passengers. She made the crossing in an unremarkable 14 days, 21 hours, with an average speed of 9.2 knots. She completed the eastbound crossing in 13 days, 12 hours, which was again considered unremarkable. Prior to her entering service, Brunel had replaced Smith's four-bladed design with a six-bladed windmill configuration that he had designed himself, in a further attempt to improve the Great Britain's performance. He also bolted an extra 2 inches of iron onto the tip of each propeller blade. On a subsequent passage to New York while carrying 104 passengers, she encountered a bad storm and lost a mast and 3 propeller blades.
The ship was able to complete her passage to New York where she underwent repairs, after which she set out on the return trip to Liverpool, during which she again lost 4 propeller blades. During the crossing, another design flaw presented itself, and the Great Britain began to roll heavily in calm seas, without the steadying influence of her sails.
The shareholders once again dipped into their own pockets to solve these technical problems. Brunel's six-bladed propeller was removed and replaced with a four-bladed propeller based on Smith's original design. The Great Britain's third mast and her iron rigging were removed. Her rigging was replaced with traditional hemp rigging.
The most significant alteration to the Great Britain was the addition of 2 bilge keels that were added on either side of the ship, with the intent of reducing the rate at which she rolled. These adjustments delayed her return to service until 1846.
During her second season of service, the Great Britain completed 2 round trips between New York and Liverpool.
However, she was laid up when one of the chains that transmitted the power of her engines to her propeller shaft showed unacceptably high wear.
While making her third crossing to New York, a series of navigational errors resulted in the Great Britain running aground in Dundrum Bay off the coast of Ireland. There was no official inquiry at the time, but recent evidence suggests that the Great Britain's captain lacked adequate navigational charts and mistook the St. John's Point lighthouse for the Calf lighthouse on the Isle of Man.
The Great Britain remained beached for nearly a year. In August 1847 she was refloated and towed to Liverpool. However, the salvage effort had exhausted the company's financial resources and the Great Britain was laid up. She was eventually sold to Gibbs, Bright and Company for £25,000. The first act of the Great Britain's new owners was to give her a full refit. Her keel had been badly damaged in the grounding, and 150 feet of her keel plating had to be replaced. At the same time, her bow and stern were reinforced with angle iron.
The Great Britain's original inclined steam engines and chain drive were replaced by smaller and lighter oscillating engines built by John Henry and Sons of Greenwich.
They were reinforced with transverse wooden and iron beams which were also intended to reduce engine vibrations. The Great Britain's original chain drive was replaced by a cogwheel arrangement. The boilers were replaced by 6 smaller boilers which doubled the amount of cargo she could carry.
Her four-bladed propeller was replaced with a smaller three-bladed propeller.
At the same time, her bilge keels were removed and placed by an external keel made of oak.
Finally, her sail plan was altered yet again, and she was given 2 schooner-rigged and 2 square-rigged masts.
Following this refit, the Great Britain was once again put back into service on the Atlantic. However, she only made one round trip between New York and Liverpool before she was sold to Anthony Gibbs and Sons, who planned to operate her on the immigrant run to Australia. When she was purchased by Anthony Gibbs and Sons, it was only with the intention of taking advantage of a temporary spike in demand for passage to Australia following the discovery of gold in 1851. However, the Great Britain would spend much of her working life on the immigrant run to Australia with the exception of trooping duty in the Crimean War and the Indian Mutiny.
Another refit. Her passenger complement was doubled from 360 to 730. Her sail plan was altered yet again, this time to a square-rigger configuration. The Great Britain was also given a removable propeller, which could be hauled out of the water when she was operating under sail alone.
In 1852, the Great Britain embarked on her first voyage to Melbourne, Australia with 630 immigrants. Upon arriving, a crowd of several thousand was waiting to greet her. When she tied up, many were willing to pay a shilling for a tour of the ship. Over time, she earned a reputation as being the most reliable ship on the run to Australia.
Eyewitnesses in 1862 described a typical passage to Australia aboard the Great Britain.
She set sail from Liverpool on October 21, 1861, with a crew of 143 and 544 passengers, including the first English cricket team to visit Australia, along with a cow, 140 pigs, 96 goats, and over 1,000 chicken, geese, and ducks. When the wind was favorable, she traveled under sail power alone. On October 8, 1868, a reporter for the Melbourne newspaper The Argus wrote, "3 passengers died during the voyage. Today, at daylight, the fine steamship Great Britain will leave her anchorage in Hobson's Bay for Liverpool direct. On this occasion, she carries less than her usual complement of passengers, the season not being a favorable one with colonists desiring to visit their native land. The Great Britain, however, has a full cargo and carries gold to the value of £250,000. As she is in fine trim, we shall no doubt probably have in time to congratulate Captain Gray on having achieved another successful voyage." Beginning in 1882, the Great Britain was converted to a sailing ship and used to transport bulk coal. She was sold to the Falkland Islands Company and used as a storage hulk until 1937, when she was towed to Spencer Cove where she was scuttled and abandoned. She caught fire in 1886 and was damaged beyond repair. While serving as a coaling station, she was used to refuel the Royal Navy strike force that defeated the German cruiser squadron under the command of Admiral Graf Spee during the Battle of the Falkland Islands in World War I. In 1939, parts of her hull were used to patch hull damage suffered by the heavy cruiser HMS Exeter following the Battle of the River Platte, which resulted in the sinking of the German battleship Graf Spee. In 1970, the wreck of the Great Britain was located and raised. She was returned to the Bristol dry dock where she was built. She has since been fully restored and is now preserved as a museum ship.